All right, good morning. We are on part 3 of Genesis. This is lesson 1, a new beginning. So can we call this another first? Why not, right? We got a lot of firsts. Did any of you, speaking of firsts, come across any firsts this week? First uses or first introductions of anything that you saw through the things that we observed? Did anything jump out at you? Okay, if not, that's okay. I will guide you through. I'm going to point them out as we go along. Because after all, Genesis is our book of firsts, right? It's the book of beginnings. We've talked about, previous to this, in the 2 parts of Genesis we've been through so far, what we have seen is God's progressive unfolding plan, right? And what he does for us is, rather than dumping on us the full theological doctrines of each subject matter, rather than do it that way, what God seems to be doing is he's introducing us to these concepts through demonstrations of the accounts that are being recorded. In other words, he says, this is who God is, and he demonstrates it in Genesis 1, that he is the God creator, he's all powerful, he's all knowing, he's sovereign, he's all these things. You see that demonstrated, not necessarily verbally conveyed, right? We saw the demonstration in the garden in chapter 3 of how God deals with sin and what its requirement is, right? Which is what? Blood. And he did so by simply clothing them. Now that's all he told us. He clothed them. But in that, what we do then as inductive students is reason through to see how can we draw out more information on that. What is it about clothing them? What had to happen to clothe them? Oh, he had to have killed an animal to put that clothing on them. Oh, gee, what does that mean, right? So it's this connection, this connecting the dots, so to speak. And so that we're going to be continuing that throughout all the parts of the book of Genesis. Anytime something new comes up, we're going to see an introduction to it, generally through the narrative and by demonstration, okay? So whenever we hit things that you recognize as maybe being firsts through the demonstration in the narrative, it's important for you to pay attention. Why? What is the first use or first introduction of something in Scripture? That's right. It's its most clearly understood meaning, its most basic, primitive points. So if you're trying to learn about what forgiveness of sin is all about, you go back to that killing of an animal and the shedding of blood, and you see there that without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. We know that explicitly. We get our commentary on that, and we can take that commentary and go back to the Old Testament account in Genesis and help fill in the needful pieces to help build our knowledge on that. But along the way, the most important thing you can do for yourself is pay attention to the narratives and to see if you can point out to yourself what are these firsts that God is introducing us to.
I think it was this week that we hit our first priest.
Yes, we did have our first priest, did we not? And what a priest is all about, and who a true priest is, and what are some of the characteristics of the priest that is the desired priest, right? That is distinctive and elite and above that of what is going to come later, which is through the Levitical system. But the one that's first introduced to us is not of the Levitical. And so when we went into Hebrews, then we had to understanding how to draw that out. So we'll be looking at that particular priest. Who was he? What was his name? Melchizedek. Okay, so let's start then by going through just each of the chapters, and we'll try to do an outline. I am not going to be putting all the points on the board. I'm going to try to put the bullet things up there for you, and then we'll have discussion on the rest of it, because she gave us 3 chapters to try to cover. I mean, really, not to mention she started us still back in Genesis 11, and gave us several New Testament cross references on that. So It took quite a lot of time, and as you know, we probably won't get through everything we want to cover, as always. But I'll do my best to try to expedite things and really ground us in the essentials that we need. And I'm really happy to know that because we are off next week for spring break, you will get 2 weeks to work on your next lesson. Our next chapter is chapter 15 of Genesis. That is the place where God is going to cut covenant with Abraham, giving him this name Abraham as opposed to Abram, and you're going to get to hopefully look into that and see what that's all about. So I highly recommend that you use the full 2 weeks, and that if you have the time, do additional research into this subject of covenant on the whole, and do your best to kind of dig that out thoroughly, okay? Because you got 2 weeks, why not use it, all right? Okay, except for people who want off. Some of us want off, but she's already done covenant, so I'm happy with that. Okay, all right, let's start with Genesis 12. Okay, Genesis 12, let me open my observation worksheet first, that'll help. Hey, by the way, how many of you found that you looked up a gazillion maps for this? Because did any one map suffice? Oh, no. I'm not kidding. I think I have, yes, I know. I think I have at least 7 or 8 different maps here to reference, because each map comes at you from a different perspective. I have one that shows you people groups of Canaan, so it shows you all the ites that lived on the land. And I have another one that shows you where the tribes of Israel landed, so that you can see which were the areas that belonged to Israel. And therefore, when you're especially looking at that chapter 14, the skirmish that was going on, why it was significant on the events that transpired through that, what was going on there, why was God giving that particular narrative to us. I also looked at a map on the migration of Abraham, starting in 11, where he came from and how he came and where he moved down into. And by the way, Haran, I have been there. It is really, really an interesting site to go to. We did a Haran, Urfa, and Ghazi, Turkey, bus trip. And on that trip, I've never been so sick in all my life. I did drink the water. That was not a good idea. And I was very sick. So you don't want to do that when you go to this place. Stick with the bottled water. But in any event, isn't it awful when the one thing comes? So interesting to go Haran in person and to consider that Abraham and his family had dwelt. And is there anything interesting that you've learned through, particularly even in chapter 11, about that place called Haran, that you now kind of make an association with?
The death of Abraham's father.
Okay, well, his father died there, yes. Who had died before they even left the land of Haran, the son, right? So curious, did that site get named? I don't know. I couldn't find anything that told me that Haran was named for his son Haran, but it seems to me like is that his son had died, they made this travel, they camped there, and they named it in honor probably of the son. That's my guess. And you take that with a grain of salt, but that to me makes logical sense. And so anyway, so there was that particular map. Then I did maps.
Before you go on,
Yeah.
I didn't pick up until this week that Charan and Haran are the same place.
I've never seen it called Charan, ever. And I mean, all the years I've done these studies, I've never seen that.
I ran across it in some of the cross references.
In some of the, wow. Huh. Well, that doesn't surprise me though.
That's Hebrew.
I don't know where the CH, that must be an Iranian or a Persian.
CH, it's often pronounced ha. Mm-hmm.
But Persian, right? But that's not in Turkey.
Well, I don't know, everything gets transliterated.
Right, I know.
There's different systems and
I know.
it's very confusing. You have to,
I agree. And I love having Cynthia sit right here because she's our translator. She helps me a lot. But yes, I know, and you're absolutely right. But that is one time I've never seen Haran called anything but Haran, but it could be for sure. Okay, no problem. I totally believe you. I'm just saying I haven't seen that, but that's interesting. And I do know that it's kind of like we were talking before we started the video about that one king, Cheddar. What's his name? I call him 𝐏𝐚𝐫𝐭. And yes, can you pronounce that one, Cynthia? Yeah. Forget it. I'm going to let her pronounce all these good things for me. In any event, it took so many maps to try to figure out where they were at, because on one map it would have certain cities, but then when you read the next verse and it mentioned another place, you go back, there's another map, find out. They act as if we all know these things. Sure. 12, we're going to try to do this systematically, 12, 13, 14. If we run ahead of ourselves, it gets too complicated for us to stay focused. So let's try to stick with chapter 12 first, okay? We did have a lead-in in order to do that. We started in Genesis 11, and we laid down just a few principles that really were just a review about Abraham and his family, basically, who comes with him, right? All right, so let's do Genesis 12 up here. Tell me, what did you see going on in chapter 12? We're going to need a theme at the end of this, so I'll leave space for it. Tell me what's going on in this chapter 12 on the whole.
Abraham is moving from Haran and gets to Egypt.
Okay, to
Egypt.
the Negev. Yes, you're right. That's true. Okay, and so he goes down to the land of Egypt to sojourn there because of this famine that occurs, right, at the end of it. But interesting is that, interesting. Can you imagine where God says, I'm going to take you to a land? And I hadn't used that word milk and honey yet, thankfully, because when he got there, there's you're like, wait a minute, God, are you sure this is the land you want me to have? And, That was the first famine. The first famine, that's true. That's mentioned, yeah, obviously, yes. You're right about that. Again, then, in the opening portion of this, we're going to break it down and do our paragraphs on it if we can, okay? Tell me what you see in verses 1 through 3. 1 through 3, what's going on there?
The Lord tells Abram to leave.
Say it again.
The Lord tells Abram to leave.
He tells him to leave his own country, and what does he tell him to do? Go to the land I will show you. And in doing that, he gives him promises, correct? So let's talk about those promises. How significant is the subject of these promises and God wanting him to go to this land to the context of the full message in 12?
This is not part of the covenant. It's just promises.
Right now, it's just promises.
It's not part of the covenant.
It will be, but this is the introduction to what will encompass that. What happens is we've already kind of seen this happen before. When God made promise to Noah, he was going to put him on an ark, and he said, I'm going to make a covenant, and he didn't do it until after he came off the ark. But he also promised him before he got on the ark that he wasn't going to flood again, right? That he was not going to do this again, but he was going to rescue him and bring him off. So God tends to, when he's establishing relationship with men, what does he tend to be doing? What do you think the purpose would be to convey this to Abram first, and then later in life give him the covenant?
Heads up for preparation.
Okay, heads up. What about with you? We're really jumping in way early on this, but what about you and your relationship when you came into your covenant with God? What was the process? Did he start with your covenant initially, or did he work into this through your life, through exposing you to who he was and how you needed him and what he would be there for. Do you think God tends to build people's faith first so that then he draws them in and establishes covenant? Or does he make a covenant? In other words, does he save you and then work with you, or does he work with you first, drawing you, and then save you and then continue working with you? Yes? The second one. Okay. So would you say that's what we're seeing going on here, where God is introducing these promises, and and the Lord is watching, not for his sake, obviously, but he's watching for the sake of allowing Abram time to receive this information, digest it, and see what it is. Have you ever heard of that verse, taste and see that the Lord is good? Do you think that might be what God seems to be doing here with Abraham? He's allowing him to taste and see, in fact, that he can walk with God and trust God, that God is faithful to his word, and that he will follow through on the things that he says. But in order for Abram to gain that kind of trust, what must he do? Yeah, allow him time to experience all that by saying, Abram, if you will go to the land that I am telling you, to this country, he's going to give to him, right? And then the journey in chapters 12, 13, and 14, we are seeing Abraham do what? Walk perfectly every time? No. So we see. Does that sound familiar? Doesn't that make you just feel so much better about your own faith walk with God? That you, in fact, have assurance that you love the Lord. You are in that. You yourselves are already in that covenant. Abram is on the journey to enter into a covenant with God. He's not there yet. Are you catching that drift? Okay. And that covenant will be entered, and literally in the New Testament, we're going to see that in the day that he makes that covenant with God, it is reckoned to him as righteousness. That's the day of his salvation. But we are watching the journey of Abram going towards this salvation relationship with God. Right now, God is introducing himself to Abram.
So the same thing in 13:16, he talks about making his descendants.
He repeats the same. Part of he's making promises. Hey, there, you know what though, Carol, you brought up something good. This also shows us something about God. Who is the covenant making the benefit for? Whose benefit is it? For us. What does it do for us? How is it beneficial to us that God makes covenant concerning these things he's promising? What is a covenant made? Pardon?
It benefits us because it depends on God as initiated by God. It's not up to us.
Okay, yes, that it's God promising it. And by the fact that he makes a covenant, then what does that do for that promise? Yes, it gives you the assurance of it. Because what he says is he validates it. And I think there's a place in Hebrews that says, by two things he cannot lie, by his word and by his oath. Oath meaning covenant. By his word, which is what we're looking at right now, then by his oath, which will be the covenant he will make to secure it. Because by these two things, he says God cannot lie. Yes?
This is the first time that God spoke to Abram, correct?
No, it isn't. For why we know that's true?
She took us to a cross-reference.
Yes, she did. We went to verses, 1 to 5. And do you remember what Acts 7 told us about God being introduced to Abram at that point? Okay. It says, and God called Abram while he was living in where? Ur of the Chaldeans, or Mesopotamia, right, which is Babylon. That is in Acts 7, verse 4. So you might want to make a note on your thing, Acts 7:4, called while in Babylon. So God had already spoken to him before. And it literally says also in the verse 3, what? Does somebody have that handy?
Depart from your country and your relatives and come into the land I will show you.
Okay. Does it say there that God appeared to him? Okay. Read 2. Haran. Isn't that interesting? Yeah.
Who was he? Because he
But he also came, but you also have to remember, and I do think that we tend to compartmentalize things about religion. There were multitudes of religions going on simultaneously around the world, right? And one of the things that we pick up on about that information is when Abram enters into Canaan, also a pagan land, who does he run into there? Melchizedek, king of, or a priest of who? God Most High. Oh, so there was Yahweh worship even in that day in the land of Canaan. Do you think there was any Yahweh worship going on in Babylon as well? Yeah. Who had been in Babylon before Abram? Noah's and the families and the spreading out of the brothers, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Remember, because we've already looked at this. So when they went, do we know that there were sons of God and daughters of, and that in therefore is the opportunities and the people there who would be taking the proclamation of God Most High out into the world all over. So could there be introduction of God Most High even in Babylon? Of course. Yeah, isn't that interesting though, Donna, how that happens? We do that. It's kind of like I said one time, we talked about, how you move from chapter to chapter, and what happens at the very first opening of chapter 12? What's the first word? Now. Now, what does that mean? It means something happened before this connected and you bring it forward. I think we just have a hard time of bringing things forward and putting them in, plugging them in our knowledge. And this is what's so awesome about doing this work that you're doing, because it's training you to stop and ponder. And if you have that kind of a question, just say, no, wait a minute. What must they have known? You've got to ask the question. You have to be the interrogator. And in doing that, then you'll begin to help yourself say, oh, that's right. Ham, Shem, and Japheth, they went out. They took the word. They went everywhere. And I've already seen in 14, Melchizedek was there. He was worshiping God Most High. Were there people all in also worshiping God Most High? Yes. It's going to be a significant thing to keep in mind when you move into chapter 15 and you see what God says to Abram when he makes the covenant with him. Heads up, okay? Make yourself a little note. Pay attention that when God makes this covenant with Abraham, you have to remember that there are still people on the land of Canaan and throughout that region, as a matter of fact, but in the land of Canaan who are worshiping God Most High. Okay? And so what's going to happen because of that, and you'll see what I'm talking about when you get in there.
the promise and then the covenant. It's for man. So when God promised, it's unconditional. He's going to do it. He knows he's going to do it regardless of Abraham.
Even without a covenant, he's going to keep his word because his word is also a promise. Yes. So in many ways, what Carol asked, I think, is really a great question to highlight, because God's word is just as sure as God's covenant. It's just that who needs the covenant? We do, because it's in human nature to want to have an assurance. This is why it's important for relationship between men and women for there to be a covenant between them. of marriage, so that there's an assurance that you're both committed to one another and only to one another, and that it's until death do you part. And because you signed on that contract and you made that covenant, you are at least operating on the assumption that that is in fact what's going to happen. At least you're supposed to be able to. But when it's between God and man, be assured that it's going to happen. When God has already given his word and then he seals it with an assurance for your sake, then you have that double assurance, right? It's both yes and amen. All right. Theme. Okay, so we know then in verse 1 through 3 what he is doing is he's giving to Abraham promises, right? Promises. What kind of promises? Land.
Great nation.
A nation.
Great name.
A great name. Okay, because when he gets that nation, it's going to make his name great. Okay.
And he says the reason is so that you will be a blessing.
Yes.
I'm going to give all this to you so you will.
Yes. And in you, all families will be blessed. Uh-huh. I'm going to shorten it.
So
But-
the difference between land and nation.
Yes. What is the difference between land and nation? Nation is the people, and land is the geography. Okay, so geography versus the people group. But how do you get to a people group? You have to have children to do it. So the implication there is that he's going to also get descendants. And then later, when he reiterates it in verse 7, he literally descendants in a side, literally promising him a son, right? A personal son who nation will be birthed. Now wait a minute. What did we learn? Abram's wife. She's barren. Now how is that going to happen? Right? So that's one of those moments where you stop and you say, whoa, that's interesting. God's going to take a man. How old is Abram, by the way? He's
When he leaves Haran.
he's 60. He's what?
75 when he leaves Haran at this point.
Yes. When he leaves Haran to go down into Canaan, he's going to be 75 years old at that point. And what we're going to see is it's going to the time when he literally does give birth to. All these pieces of this puzzle also should be, I think, kind of accumulated into the store bank of your brain about how God is working this out. Why is he working it out this way? Why wouldn't he just get a wife that's prolifically fertile, right? Who could have multitudes of children? Right? What would be his point?
Because they mention it back in, I think it's 11 in the genealogy that she's barren, and then they come back to the story later. It kind of made me stop and go, is that a first? Was she the first woman to ever have barrenness?
Oh, that's a good
How
question.
shocking that would have been to everybody around her, like, oh my gosh, what's wrong with her?
Yeah, right,
Everybody has lots of children. She's like,
right, right.
she must
Yeah.
be a sinner.
Yeah, right. Oh, absolutely. Because one of the things we know, if you do a research study on that subject matter, it is the God who opens the womb and closes the womb, and the people knew that it was a blessing from God that you gave birth or you did not give birth. It is God's choosing. And for the barren woman, if there are any in this room, and I don't know, but for those who might have struggled with this, this is something that where you have to go to the Lord and say, Lord, you are the sovereign over my life and over my body. And it's a heartbreak for a woman to not have a child. And the guys don't totally grab hold of this, I don't think always, but it is it's just this deep need because God designed us to be moms, and therefore it's just I want in us. All right, so let's move on. So we have promises, a land, a nation, and in you all the nations will be blessed. Now you tell me, What do you think that being blessed, the nations being blessed, is an inference toward? Is it speaking of anything that you can think of? How will he be a blessing to all the families of the earth?
Well, they'll be in reverence to God. I mean, God will be in their lives.
Okay, God will, and how will God?
Well, they will show the world God.
Okay, they will show the world God. Okay.
The seed from 3:15.
And again.
The seed from 3:15.
Okay, in Genesis 3, verse 15, what was promised to Eve?
The seed.
A seed. Do you think this progression of the story is still maintaining that thread of the seed, the promise of the seed? Do you think that's still going to come through in this? Okay, speaking of another 3:15, I actually think it's 3:16 in Galatians. You know, Galatians 3:16 says about that seed that was promised to Eve. Who is it? It's Christ. It's Christ Jesus who is that seed that was literally promised. As a matter of fact, in Galatians, when you go back to 6, 7, and 8, I hope you're going to get into this next week, but in there it literally says that when God made this promise to Abram, he was preaching to him the gospel. Now who do you think that blessing is? Yeah. So I don't know about you, but in me, every time I see this word blessed, I just put a cross on there to remind me, how is he going to be a blessing? Because through him is going to come the seed, through his bloodline. He's going to give him a land and a nation. We're going to have a blessing because of what God's going to do through that nation. Okay, that's 1 through 3. Then you can look at 4 through 9. And then what was his response? Yeah, Abram went. He obeyed. Isn't that amazing? And then God again, and when Abram went, then what did God do?
He appeared again.
Yeah. Verse 7, what does he do then? After he went, then what? He appeared to him again, right? Now the Lord appeared to Abram and said, so he reappears to him. I'm going to. He repeats or he restates the promise.
I didn't look it up yet, I wondered if I did. In verse 7, when it says to your descendants or offspring, is that actually seed or not?
To your descendant and offspring. Well, yeah.
So if you look up the original word.
I don't know. I don't think that one's leading. It will be by virtue of it's literally saying, I'm going to give you a nation of people, and they are going to inherit this land that I'm. Now with that thought, the promise of a land in verse 5, he says about that land, who's going to attain that land? I'm sorry, say it again. His descendants are going to obtain it. It's going to come through him and through his obedience, yes. He has to initiate this, in other words, right? But is he going to be the one to possess the land? No. He is receiving a blessing that he will never receive. He is receiving a promise that he's never actually going to tangibly possess for himself. So the land will be possessed by his descendants after him. So what does that tell you about Abram and this whole relationship and this conversation about what God has promised to give to him concerning the land? If somebody said to you, I'm going to give you land, but it's not going to be for you, it's going to be for your children. And you have, in order for your children to receive it, you're going to have to do A, B, and C, whatever it is.
He was very obedient, trusting in the Lord.
I mean, that is forethought. That's looking down the line, and that's selflessness. That is a man who's looking forward into the generations down the road and saying, my obedience to God depends on their being blessed in that manner. So in a way, there's another way of being a blessing. It's a slightly different blessing. It's not speaking about the seed, but it is speaking about his obedience will affect the generations that are going to come ahead of him. That's very interesting. So in all this, then, what do we see about Abram here? What do we see about him? He went. Yeah, we see his faith here, don't we? Unbelievable faith, because he's not even yet receiving it. What about the promise of descendants? What is he believing God for, and what does he not have? But what does he have?
He doesn't have kids, but he does have a wife.
He has a wife that's barren, and he doesn't have any kids, and yet he's believing God for descendants, not just a few, but enough descendants that you will build a nation out of it, that there will be enough that there will be. This is amazing faith. I mean, it's no wonder he's in the hall of faith, right there in Hebrews 11, right? His descendants are going to become so numerous as the dust that can't be counted. That had to be mind-blowing. Okay, all right, so we go from this moment here of great faith. He went, he had this faith, this belief that God's going to do these really supernatural things that really seem impossible with a barren wife, and he's in a land that he's literally just traversing upon, but he doesn't own yet. It's not in his possession, and by the way, won't be, because he's told his family will get it, his descendants, but he won't. So he's never really going to have that tangibility of assurance in that manner. He's simply going to believe it by faith. So now you move into the next segment. You get into 10 through 16, and now what?
This kid gets a little wonky. He walks in thinking, oh, Pharaoh's going to kill me unless we do this other thing, instead of just going, well, God said I'm going to have descendants, I'm just going to walk in there.
Yeah. What is the quality or the characteristic in this man that pops out at this point? Fear. Abram has fear here.
Real quick back about how he demonstrated that he had faith in verse 7 and 8. He built 2 altars, and then after he built the second one, it said he called upon the name of the Lord. It makes me think about, who was it in the lineage when they first
Yes.
called upon the name of the Lord?
Was it Seth? Yes.
And then men began to call on the name of the Lord.
Yeah, and then the men began to call upon the name of the Lord. Now, interesting, I did do a little bit of reading on that. Did anybody else? Do you got any insights about that idea of calling on the name of the Lord? One of the translations says that literally speaking about a preaching of the gospel, that he literally began to preach the gospel to those people around him. I thought that was interesting, because one of the things later is we saw that Enoch was a preacher of righteousness, remember? So we saw the first preacher through Enoch. And then Noah was a preacher in his day. And so here we have another inference to that. That's what's speaking of. He's calling on the name of the Lord. So he's probably, speaking congregationally, so to speak, to a group of people, and speaking about the Lord and calling on his name in public prayer and in some kind of a congregational worship service, is my guess.
Plus, if he was building altars and sacrificing to God.
Building altars and exactly. So almost basically church. Isn't that cool? All right. That's the best I could. I did do quite a bit of looking, and most of the commentaries totally look way beyond it, didn't even address it. I think because it's just vague, but I did. What he did is broke down the language, and by breaking the language down, the inference is about preaching and speaking in a public forum. Okay. All right, so we see he has this fear. He fears for his wife and life, and in doing that, what's the storyline here? What does he do?
Well, he says, let them think that you're my sister.
Uh-huh.
It's one of those lies by technicalities, kind of, because she's half-sister.
And in doing that, what does he do to his wife? He puts her in great danger, doesn't he? Okay, so he's fearing for his own life. Okay, well, so here, have my wife. right? Take her instead.
Or not even my wife, my sister.
Yeah, right. Oh, yeah, my sister. That's right.
Otherwise, they'll kill me and they'll keep you anyway. So this way,
Yeah.
it'll
It's,
go well for me.
That's not to correct you, it's to say it's even worse, right?
yeah, in a way, because it was, although it is his half-sister, which we didn't really talk about, but I mean, he married his half-sister. Terah apparently had another wife, and this was a child of that union, and so he married his half-sister, which in those days was perfectly fine. Okay, so there's that. The other thing is, if you think of this as a part of the process through which God is going to bring about these descendants and supernaturally birth this nation, right, through Sarah. So what is Abram, through his fear and through his actions, what's he doing to God? Yeah, he's really putting an obstacle on God's plan, so to speak. I mean, he's like being this stumbling stone in the middle of God's work. He's, instead of being on God's side, being his companion and his helper, instead he becomes an obstacle because he's doing these things that could thwart the plan of God. But can God's plans be thwarted? No. So we've already talked about this, right? How often do we go back to the fact that it does not matter what you or I do that's wrong and bad and sinful. They're still wrong and bad and sinful, but we are not going to thwart the plan of God.
Okay, so if he didn't get her back before she was taken as Pharaoh's wife, could the seed have, the promised seed could have come through another woman?
Well, obviously, the problem with that is, how does God view marriage?
Sacred. The covenant.
It's one man, one woman for how long? Forever. So God's perfect plan would be to work through the one wife that God gave her in covenant marriage. And also, if you think about it, Carol, why would it be more powerful for God to use Sarah than to use some other woman?
She's barren.
Because she's already proven to be barren. And in being a barren woman, what's going to happen when she gives birth to Isaac?
God's going to get the glory. Miracle.
It's going to be a miracle baby. And do you think that has a more powerful statement in the process of what God is going to be doing through that nation and those people by taking a barren woman, and by the way, an old man, we're going to get there, but he's going to be very old by the time he also, she's old, he's old, they're both old. I'm old, so we know they're really old.
Well, another thing my husband brought up and just gave cause to think about it is, back then, did they actually marry or did they just take?
No. Oh, absolutely not. No, they married. Now, Pharaoh, no, he could take because they were of a pagan culture, but Abram was a follower of at this point, he's following God Most High. And I do think the standard, because remember, Noah and his 3 sons came off that ark. They all had relationship with God, the Lord, right? And therefore, that was the God that they were following and living in the standard of. And that God is the God who said marriage is one man, one woman in union and forever. And so most of humanity, I believe, even in that day, just as is true even today, most people understand marriage is one man, one woman, and for life. Even though we don't all follow it, it's still the common knowledge. And it's what they're fighting against. They're trying to rip it out of the books of our laws, and they're trying to change our standard of how we handle marriage. They want it to be anything you want to make it, a man with a man, a woman with a woman, and that's purely fine. But God says, no, it's one man, it's one woman. And so in this particular case, yeah, it couldn't have been any other woman except Sarah if it was going to be this supernatural work of God.
Which shows us here God's protection.
Yeah, we absolutely see the God protecting what? It's not his first time to protect his plan, though, is it? How did he protect his plan the last time? That was really a big one. The flood. He said, okay, let's start all over. Then he makes a covenant. I won't do that again, even though man is really bad. I promise I won't do that again. But he did start over at that point. And then how did he alter man's life system of living so that we wouldn't get as bad as the days of Noah so quickly?
Instituted civil law.
He instituted civil law. Aren't you guys are learning so much? I'm just so proud of you. All right. Okay, so here we see Abram fears for his life, right? So now, instead of having faith, what do we see? We see his failure, right? Right? His failure. So he's up and then he's down. Now, the next thing we see then following that is about, starting in 17, it goes all the way to 17 to 20, sorry.
One of the things that I saw though in verse 16 is that even when we mess up, God still still takes care of us.
That's exactly where,
We're blessed with servants and all, so God is increasing his wealth, even during the time of messing up.
oh my gosh, I looked at that and I said, oh my gosh, I wonder if that was almost like rubbing salt in Abram's womb at that time. Wouldn't you just be so ashamed? You had acted so unfaithfully and had so much fear, and you fear for your own life to the point that you put both your wife in danger and God's plan in danger, and then God turns around and gives you a blessing. I mean, you have to, yeah, I know. That's how I would feel right there. That look, that's it. All right. Abram's fear for his life shows us his failure. So he's up and he's down. 17 to 20, then, what does God do?
Plague.
Yeah. So,
This is just on Pharaoh and his house, though.
he struck Pharaoh, his house. Okay, and he did so because why? Because of Sarah. Okay, does that actually answer your question, Donna? When you asked about Sarah, did it have to be Sarah? When God struck Pharaoh, did he do it because of what Abram had done? No, he did it because of Sarah. So what does that tell you about the plan? Who did it include when God made covenant with? It includes Sarah. Sarah, so you might want to make yourself a note. Because of Sarah, so Sarah is part of God's plan.
I think in a way where he's actually revealing Sarah's faith. So it's interesting. She went along and submitted to
Yes. Oh,
instructions, but that's not even what we're going to do. But in verse 16 also, so both times, 66, and for her sake, God dealt well with Abraham.
yes.
And because of Sarah, he dealt with the favor.
Yeah.
Both times it's for Sarah's sake. So God is revealing and showing his covenant and his protection and love, and he's honoring Sarah's obedience.
Yes. Absolutely. So we learned so many. One of the things that you all were supposed to do this week was to do two lists, one on Abram, one on God. And in particular, what she's wanting us to do is to keep a running account of the things that we see about how God is operating with mankind, and what is the characteristic of God? How does he deal with us? What is his desire for us? What is our relationship supposed to be like with him? So in this case now, what we see then is, do you remember in the first 3 verses where he said, I'm going to bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you? In that statement, God is literally letting Abram know that he's going to be his protector, right? He's going to protect him. So what we see is God is keeping that promise of blessing and cursing as in the fact that he goes in and he saves and rescues Sarah out of the mess. So for the sake of his own plan of salvation and for the sake of Abram, whom he has made these promises to. And what's interesting about this is Abram, obviously God has a huge advantage. He knows the end from the beginning. If it were you and I doing this, we would look at a person who fails and we would immediately withdraw all of our promises and say, well, you've not lived up to your, I'm with you. But God is so patient. And so what do we see then about God in the way that he's dealing with him here? Mercy. Oh, yeah. God protects. He's full of mercy.
Slow to anger, long-suffering.
Yeah. Slow to anger.
I looked at those two words, curse, in verse 3, the one who curses you, I will curse.
Mm-hmm.
I know this is not part of that list there, but they're two different words,
Okay.
curse. And
That's
the
interesting.
one who curses you is kalal, it's lighter curse, it's to treat lightly less than they deserve. But when God says, I will curse, it's A-O-R, and it means, it's a much stronger word, and it means to impose a barrier, to ban.
Wow.
And I was interested in that because the history of all Israel's enemies is God treats them pretty severely.
Yeah. And why do you think that is? I mean, if you think about the fact that, God has made Abram promises, right? But ultimately, is it about Abram? Is God's promises to Abram about Abram specifically and only? No. It has a much further ramification for families of the whole earth. And so what God is doing here is so much more important than this one little man who has given his wife off to Pharaoh to protect his own life. God is seeing the bigger picture, and he's saying, I'm looking for salvation for the whole world through a seed that's going to come. I have a plan. He's part of that plan. I've already established that plan through him. Fortunately, he knew the end from the beginning. He knew what Abraham would become. But where are we at in that journey? We're at the very beginning.
Well, and clearly this was part of God's plan for Abram to mess up and then see.
Well, I don't think it was his plan for him to mess up, but he knew of it. He knew it. He knows.
And
Right.
through that, Abram, his faith was then renewed by being bailed out.
Yes. And so grab hold of as you're watching this journey. It's he's up and does good, and then he's down. He's up and he does good, and then he's down. Bad. And just like the days of your lives. All the days of your lives.
There's a lot of foreshadowing in the Bible, but there's also some interesting reverse foreshadowing, and I saw that in this. Remember, Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and at some early point in his life, the Magi came and gave him gold and frankincense and myrrh, and then his family had to flee to Egypt, and they had money to live off of because they had just been given all of it.
Right.
That's right.
Money. Yes, so this is like a reverse foreshadowing of that. Abraham was where he wasn't supposed to be. He had left the land, but God used it anyway to give him great wealth that he then
Goes back with.
back to the land and helped him establish his family in the land with lots of livestock and gold and things like that.
Right.
I
And
thought it was interesting.
that is very interesting. It's a really good, very good insight. I really like that. Okay, so that's kind of the ups and downs of this. So what we see here then, we see his faith, his failure, but what we see about God is what? God's faithfulness. And I'm going to add on here, and grace, because it's kind, and I almost didn't know where to stop. Patience, kindness, goodness, I wanted to put it all in there. But the idea of his faithfulness and his grace, he's forgiving in our failures. He's faithful to his promises. I mean, and so even though man is up and down, God remains the steady one in the relationship that we have with him. And it's not dependent on us being steady. Although we try to be steady. We should try really hard. But it isn't about us being the steady one. God is the steady one. Okay.
Real quick, I know we need to move on, but we should talk about foreshadowing. So again, this is the first time there was someone mentioned earlier, the famine. And because of the famine, he ended up in Egypt. Later, because of the famine, they all ended up in Egypt.
Yes.
And when he needed to save Sarah, and when he needed to save the children of Israel, he caused the house of Pharaoh to have great plagues.
Yes. Isn't that amazing? I know. It's like there are these, in other words, there's nothing new under heaven. It's like an Ecclesiastes quote, right? Everything just keeps repeating and repeating. And it seems like that in the patterns of this, obviously Egypt is the land close to them, so they're going to be continually going back and forth. It's also why then when Israel does go into the land finally and take possession, God says, now stop going down there for your help. Stay here. I will provide. And what did they do? Kept going back down. They just can't help themselves, right? All right, let's go on. Do you have? Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I just found myself like ruminating on the fact that all of that folds back into what a covenant is. Like,
Yes.
this covenant is not like our contracts where it's like,
Right.
you do this as long as you do X, Y, Z.
No.
It's like,
These are unconditional covenants, and that is part of what you're going to look at when you see chapter 15. And God has him literally enter into covenant at that point in his life. And in that, it's an unconditional covenant. And, there's so much to teach. There's just so much. 2 weeks, got time. Let's give us a title. Just throw some things out. How did you title chapter 12?
I just said Abram travels Haran to Egypt.
You went with geography all together.
I did.
Let's go with the narrative. Next.
That's what I did.
That's good. No, that's good. No, that's fine. Okay. Any others? What's going on in the narrative?
So I just got on the blessings and the curse.
Yeah.
I saw he blesses Abraham and then he brings a curse on Pharaoh.
That works. A blessing and a cursing. Okay. If you're now one of the things that you need to consider is we are following a narrative that keeps progressing, right? Who is the primary subject of the narrative?
Abram.
That's right, Abram. So concerning Abram, who's the other primary subject? God. So something about Abram and the Lord. What is going on between Abram and the Lord in chapter 12?
The promise of the land and the seed and your offspring.
Yeah. So the Lord promises Abram land, seed, and nation. Okay. Or any other thoughts?
We can't use that one. That's what you gave us for our theme from 1
There
to
you
3.
go. Good job.
I don't use it anymore.
Good catch, Kristen. Too.
Well,
Okay.
you can never, Katie says you can never use, if you theme your paragraph, then it supports your main theme, but it can't be word for word the same.
Yeah. So you don't want this to be your title. The promises are not your title. But what did God do with Abram? Where did he come from?
Originally?
Ur of the Chaldeans, right?
Yep.
From Babylon. And then he went to Haran. He was there for a while. And then what does it say he does in chapter 12? The Lord says to Abram, do what? Go forth into land. So would you call this a calling of the Lord on Abraham's life, that he calls him into something? Something like the Lord calls Abram, or you could say he calls Abram with promises, but that's just a little bit redundant. However, you could still, I would not be terrible with that one. Abram called by God, maybe even.
God promises Abraham the land, but Abraham runs to Egypt.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. All right. How about we do this?
Yeah, the word promise is never used in the scripture.
Okay, whatever you title it, just understand each of these paragraphs. The Lord, now watch the flow of my thinking here. Okay, the Lord calls Abram. Now I need each of my paragraphs to explain to me how he does that. He calls him through promises of the land, the nation, and that the families of the earth will be blessed. He calls them, and Abram responds. Abram went, and then God restates those same promises. Then Abram fears. The Lord called him, but now Abram's in fear for his life. But when the Lord calls him, God is the one who struck Pharaoh's house because of Sarah, his wife. So you see the progression of the thought that he has a calling, and God is working in it. God is present in it. And some of these, once you do that, then you can go back and start tweaking your titles and your paragraphs to see the flow so that it goes much more crystallized, if you can.
When you can see it similarly, like when the way he deals with Jonah, right? I want you to go do this. No, I'm not going to do that. Well, yes, you are.
Right.
I'm afraid I'm going to go down here, and I guess I'm going to give my wife off over here. No, you're not.
Yeah, yeah. So you could even put I'm not sure. Anyway.
Protection of Sarah, too.
Yeah, of Sarah too, yeah. Okay. All right, so let's move on to 13. What do we see in 13? What is the major thing going on in that chapter? Okay, Abram and Lot are going to separate. Now, what do you see going on with Abram? Well, first of all, I just want to real quickly go back to chapter 11. In chapter 11, and also Acts 7, which we talked about a moment ago, he tells him to go out. What does he do? When he tells him to go to Canaan, what does he tell him to do? Go back to that chapter, was it 2 or 3 in Acts 7 that you read, I think, earlier, Susan? 2 and 3, right. He appears to Abraham in 2. And what does he tell him to do?
Leave your country and your relatives.
Leave your country, leave your relatives, and come to the land I will show you. What do we see him doing in chapter 13, though? He has his nephew Lot still with him. And even prior to that, what had he done? He had took his father and his brother and he had taken a lot of people with him, right? And so when we get to chapter 13, what we see then is a problem. For God to be able to move forward with this plan, he has to do something to go about separating the two of them, right? And that is, in fact, what we do see happen.
The difference that in 11, it says Terah took Abram his son and Lot her son and Sarah. Yeah, Terah took him.
And it's a
In my mind, it was
patriarchal
kinda
system.
Like, Abram went, hey, God told me I have to go. All right, we'll go. Like, is what
Right.
I kind of pictured there.
Well, of
happening.
course, yes, absolutely. I mean, I don't. Terah didn't have that call. It was Abram that had the call, and he would have spoke to his father. But the father, being the patriarch, what happens to Terah? He dies in Haran before he comes down into Canaan, into the land that God promised. So one of Haran does. They go to Haran. Dad now dies. Now he enters the land. He still has Lot with him, who probably is quite a bit younger than him. He's a nephew. And in this situation, then, how does God handle this? What do we see going on in verse 1 through 7? They got 2 minutes. Oh my goodness. Any other way. He could have taken Lot's life, maybe had an enemy come against him and kill him, or, I mean, anything like that. God. This is really So let's talk first of all, though, about what we see here. Abram, with his family, let me see how it says this. They go and all that belonged to him, and Lot with him. Now Abram was very rich in livestock and silver, and in from the Negev as far as Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there formerly, and where Abram returned to Egypt. So with his family returned to Canaan. Okay, and Lot went with Abram. So we see with his family. Is that a problem? Yeah. So again, what do we got going on here with Abram? Is it faith or failure? We see his failure, and the reason we know it's really talking about failure is because what does God do? He separates them, and as soon as he separates them, what does God do?
He's like, now here's the land.
He returns to appear to him again, and now he says, now I'm going to give you the land, right? Look, see all the land that you see from there and here to there, it's all going to be yours.
I wonder if he hadn't taken his family, if he could have sustained himself in the land, not have to go to Egypt.
Possibly, absolutely. I mean, there's so many things on this that's interesting. But do you think that the journey that Abram is going on and the way that he's going about it is human reasoning? Is it logical to take your family with you? Right? Is it not even cultural that you have an obligation to be with your parents, your brothers, sisters, right? So all these things make perfect sense in the thinking of Abram, who's not yet fully divorcing himself from the world and walking. He's not willing to step out on the tight wire, across the road and with the bridge down below and, miles and miles of distance. He's not walk yet. He's still yet one foot with the Lord, obeying God, right? And in the process of that, then he's making mistakes along the way. Can you relate? I can. Boy, can I. Okay, so Abram is with his family. He returns to Canaan. He enters the land that God promised him, Canaan. That's in verse 4. His Lot is still with him. They're living together. The land cannot sustain. Okay. All right, now, so that's his failure. And then what happens then? In 8 to 13.
Abram says to Lot, we got to separate, so you do what you want, and I'll go whichever
Yeah.
direction you don't go.
Isn't that interesting? So what does Lot choose?
The best looking.
Yeah, he picks the best. Was that a good choice? No, big problem because it's going to cause trouble in a minute.
Verse 13 tells you exactly why that was a bad choice.
What was the bad choice? Yeah, right.
The men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly and sinners against the Lord.
Isn't that amazing? Okay, so in this case then, Lot chooses, let's see, how did I put it? Lot chooses, I had it on here. Basically it's Jordan, right? And then Abram, he settled in Canaan.
Have you ever read something that back in that culture, it would have been for Abraham
Abraham should have been the one to choose first. He was the patriarch of the family, and so I don't know, is that grace that Abraham allowed him to do?
Okay, so you tell me, what do you see? First of all, what was the outcome?
It was not favorable for Lot. That was first.
It was favorable for Lot, but what did Abraham end up with?
The land he's supposed to have.
Yeah, he actually ends up with the land. So in the doing of it that way was very magnanimous, right? He was being very gracious. He allows Lot to take the choicest land, and he does. In doing that, what do you think is the outcome of that for Abram? What was the outcome of that for Abram? Number one, he got the land he was supposed to have. And what other benefits do you see because of where he went versus where Lot went?
He wasn't at Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah, he wasn't in the dangers either. All the things that come with being around that, and also in land that so if you're taking that land versus the lush green areas that Lot went to, your enemies are going to be fewer. Your day-to-day living is going to be tougher, but you're going to be safer, and your land is going to be securely yours.
So I laughed about this as a Texan. It's better to choose to live around good people than it is to choose really good land.
Yeah. Amen, sister. High five. That's because I married a Texan. I'm not a Texan. I'm definitely not a Texan. Okay. Not that I have anything against Texas. Don't let me. Okay. Lot chooses Jordan. Abram settled in Canaan. So we see Lot chooses. And in that statement, then, what do we see about him? What do we see Abram exhibiting? Faith. Isn't that amazing? He trusted that the way it would end up is the way that God wanted it to. In a way, I almost want to say this is the first casting of lots. It isn't, but it's a good one, yes? Okay, so we see the first opportunity here then that God shows the faith of Abram is blessed because Lot chooses exactly where God wants Abram to land. And so after that, Lot had separated from him, and then the Lord restates his promise in 15. So he gets what he wants, and then God, again, restates the promises. And that's in verse 15. Okay, 8 to 13 is that one. And then let's go on to the last part is 14 to 18. What do we see this again? Mm-hmm. Oh, this is where he stays. Oh, I should have put this up here. 14 to 18. Right, God restates the promises in 14 to 17, actually. Arise and walk about the land through its breadth. Then Abram moved his tent and came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. And it's very interesting because when he mentions these places, and if you go in and do your research on them, you really do get the fullness of that picture that the land that God gave to Abram versus Lot was really a protection for him in so many ways. Because it was not really desirable land, it was barren and it was desert and all those things, had very little water on it, all those negatives. In many ways, this was a protection for him. Do you guys remember the stories that Corrie ten Boom talked about when she was in a concentration camp, about being in the barracks, and the barracks that she got put into was the most lice-infested of all of them, and for that reason, who wouldn't come in there? The guards. And it became a protection, and therefore, what was she able to do when she was in there? Worship God and teach Bible studies to all the women. So in a way, this is kind of that storyline. It's the same thing. By Abram having the land that was the least desirable in the moment. Now, it's not least desirable today. It's beautiful and lush everywhere because of the ingenuity of the Hebrew people of being able to water their land through all these watering systems and so forth. And we're approaching those days when God is going to return it to the state of the Garden of Eden. I can't wait to see that happen. But Abram was literally protected. So when he makes this last statement, after he makes these promises to him, he restates, I'm going to give you the land that I have promised to you. This is for you and your descendants. So there's the descendants promise again. Then he says, and he lived at Mamre in Hebron. And that is this is a protection for him as well. Okay, so we see his failure, his faith. Faith, failure, failure, faith. What do you think we're getting to next? All right, so let's go to Genesis 13, or 14 rather.
Can you give us the theme for that one?
Oh, theme, good idea. What do you want for a theme on that? Yeah.
I had Abram and Lot separated.
Okay, Abram and Lot separate. That'll work because how do they do it? Abram goes one, Lot chooses one, Abram goes the other. And it says that at the time they were together, so they needed to separate. So here shows that they were living and dwelling together and the land cannot sustain them. Then they separate by Lot's choosing, and Abram actually lands in the land of Canaan where he should. And then God restates the promise. So what does this tell you about God then in this chapter? What do we learn about God?
We finally got to what he told him to do way back in third.
Yeah.
He's still patient.
Get rid of all your
So
family and
patience.
place I'm gonna show you. Yeah.
Okay, so he's still being patient. And,
But he's getting his purpose done.
okay, so what quality or characteristic of God is that?
Faithfulness or power to his
Sovereignty.
promises.
Yeah, sovereignty. His sovereignty, right? His faithfulness.
What was it you said a couple of weeks ago when we were doing something, you kept writing and repeating? Was it his unthwartable purposes or something?
Yeah, unthwarted.
Purpose.
Uh-huh.
He had said a long time ago, Abram, I want you alone to end up in Canaan. It took all this journey to get there. Yeah, and he had to get his dad away and his Lot away.
I also saw how expansive his promises are. Abraham had no idea what God was promising him.
I know.
He saw a little tiny bit of it, and it's the same for us. We just see a little tiny bit of what God is.
You know what's interesting about,
Just
yeah, it is. It's way beyond that. And I don't think that he really had a full comprehension of it yet at this point. But when we get into 15, I think he comes to see that. Because when he comes to the realization of what God is actually promising him through these descendants and the blessing, what that actually means, we're already there because we have New Testament commentary and we know this. We're at the other side of history on this. But he's going to discover it, though, in chapter 15. And how we know that is because of Galatians commentary. The commentary that's given to us in Galatians 3 explains to us exactly what it was that Abraham was believing God for. And why it is, therefore, that in that moment of covenant making with God, it was credited to him as righteousness. But right now, we're not there. So we see a man who's being obedient to God. He's having glimmers of faith. He's hot and cold, kind of, right? And even in faith, remember when we saw Noah and the three boys come off the ark, and the first thing they do was Noah gets drunk and Ham, betrays his father by exposing him to his brothers. What we see is people of faith do not walk a perfect straight line. and that we're fallible, and we're weak, and we have weaknesses, whatever they are for each of us individually. They come upon us. Satan knows when to attack. But what I think is so encouraging through watching these narratives and really paying attention is knowing that God is not expecting you to be perfect. He's got contingencies in the plan to cover for you and for me. And he will work with us or around us, either way, right? He will, but if you and I belong to him, and we do, we can be assured that God will eventually bring us on board with him. He will get us to be where he wants us to be. Because he says that all things work together for good for those that love the Lord. And so he will take even these ups and downs, the failures God will use to teach us things about who God is and his faithfulness, and about what it is that his agenda is that we're supposed to be looking forward to. This is the thing about all of us in our personal lives and our ministries. Every one of us in here, we have different spiritual giftings and different works that we're involved in, different ministry fields. But all of us have to have the same goal. And the goal is to build the kingdom of God and to walk faithfully with him. So this is what God is working with Abram in trying to accomplish, is to bring Abram on board with his agenda, to get him to see the bigger picture. Like what Amanda was saying a minute ago about, he doesn't really see the vastness of all that God is really doing yet. But at a certain point he will begin to. But even when he finally gets there, he's still going to make mistakes. Just like Noah did, just like David did, just like, so many of the great pillars of our faith that you see in the scriptures, they're fallible people. And I think that this gives us the grace to accept that about us, but not as an excuse to fall into that on purpose, but rather to acknowledge that when we fail, we are to turn back to God, get right with him, and then move forward. You know, there has to be grace, though, on yourself, because we're human, and we fail. Okay. Pardon?
You should have done a mic drop after all of that. What is all that?
Ba-boom. Yeah, okay, all done. No, she says I can go home now. Okay, we got one more chapter to cover here. All right, Genesis 14. I know. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Theme. All right, so we have in this book, this chapter 14. This was the interesting, as far as complication. I heard a couple of people came up with some really clever solutions on how to parse out who was who in this mess. For one thing, we've got a lot of big names that are very hard to pronounce, right? And with every name is associated also a very unfamiliar sounding geographical location, and sometimes you can't tell the person's name from the geography. And sometimes they're actually one and the same, like Haran and Haran, right? Here we have complicated. So who's doing what in this? What is ultimately this storyline about? Was there something that kind of gave you a really good idea? What do you think?
Verse 4.
Okay.
So you have the kings and the kingdoms over there in Mesopotamia, and you have these Canaanite kings. And the Canaanite kings served over here under that one particular cheddar guy. And then they rebelled. They said, we're done with this. After 12 years, we're not going to do it. And so that's what started the war. It's like, well, you're not going to rebel, so I'm going to come get you.
Right.
That's the whole...
So it was a geopolitical rebellion going on. And thank you. I love that one. That's 5. I can get that one. Once I saw that, I went, oh, good. Now I'll go back and see if I can get 4 kings. Is that how you did it? I did. I went, okay, I know one team's 4 and one team's 5. I got to have 2 different colors for that. So, very good. Yeah, good job, Christina. So this is what I did is I color-coded verse 1 in one color. I color-coded verse 2 in another color, and I gave each of those kings a crown with a correlating color. So they're all the same. They're not marked individually. They're all marked the same in verse 1, purple, and all the same in verse 2, which is like a teal green color on mine. I did the same thing when I went down to verse 8 and 9. I also color-coded those two verses just to separate those two people groups who are fighting against one another. That helped clarify visually for me what I was reading on the page. You could even do this in your Bible, just a light color, a pencil mark on each of those two, just so you group them. And then you got your two groups. And literally verse 9 tells you it is 4 kings against 5 kings. So that was very helpful. All right, now that was done, now this was interesting. You see this argument going on. What did you see happening in verse 5 through 7? This is really cool. And who does it tie us back to? Okay, do these things sound familiar? Oh, wasn't that some of the Nephilim back in chapter 6 of Genesis? Oh my goodness. Do you remember when I took you through the Nephilim and I showed you all those millions of cross-references and said, these are all the different names of different giants that all basically come from the same group of people? This is the Rephaim, the Zumim, the Emim. Okay, so therefore, when it talks about these Babylonian kings, right? 1 to 4 Babylonian kings who come in to conquer the Canaanite kings, right? Basically. Those come in and they wipe out all these giants of the land. That's how powerful those 4 kings were. You're not talking minor. These are the mighty men of old. Remember? Men of renown. The ones who were so respected and so honored and looked up to by the people in the days of Noah. And who were on the earth again after those days. Guess where we just saw them? Back on the earth again. It doesn't say Nephilim, but it's all his brothers. Okay, and so now we've got these 4 kings doing this mighty thing. I mean, this is no small feat. Did you all catch that? This is no small feat. 4 kings coming against giants on the land.
That's what makes the whole thing when Abram goes to rescue
Thank you.
316 or whatever it was,
Yeah.
18 men.
Yes, that's what makes the supernatural power of this whole presentation. You catch that once you slow down and say, oh, these guys just conquered giants on the land. And a bunch of them. There were like 6 different family names here, groups, right? Different, either cities, 6 different cities or regions, right? Areas of the country, and wiped them out. And then who comes along behind? Little old Abram with his 318 men. And he wipes them out by night and totally takes them over. So let's break this down then. Now let's try to look at the picture then. 1 to 9, what do we see happening there?
The war between the 4 Mesopotamian kings and the 5 Canaanite kings.
Okay, I'm going to put between Babylon, kings basically, and Canaanite kings. And if you wanted to, you could say 4 and 5. The 4 kings versus the 5 kings, right? Because we get that literally in verse 9. 4 kings against 5. But it is important to say that this is basically a conquest or a battle that's going on between a foreign nation with the Canaanite land where Abram is now living on. The Canaanite land, by the way, which is the land God has promised to give to Abram and his descendants after him. So in knowing that, can you understand why God is doing what he's doing in this particular narrative? Why is God allowing Abram with his 318 men to wipe out an army that just wiped out multitudes of giants off the land? Why does God do that supernatural thing through Abram?
I think he does it for Abram.
Yes.
Through Abram, but for Abram's benefit. So he's like, hey, this is what I can do for you. This just trust in me.
Okay, so in one
I'm
way
gonna
it's to,
protect you, yeah.
okay, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And these men came against your family, Lot. And so I'm going to protect you, and I'm going to show you that I'm watching over you, and I'm protecting you to do the things I've promised. Okay, good. And might there be any other reason you can think of that God would make sure that Abram wins this particular war?
Was that the land he was getting?
Yes, it was the land he was supposed to inherit. So God is protecting the land as well. Isn't that interesting? Okay, so we have that. Now, what happened then in 10 to 12 when this war began? What happened? And what's the significant point of 10 to 12?
Babylon took Lot.
Yeah, that Lot went and took his captivity. So Lot is taken captive, right? So we have this war going on. He's taken captive. Now, what happens in 13 to 16? By the way, cowardly little old Abram who sold his wife off to.
He's referred to as the Hebrew in
Oh, I loved that.
I've never seen that yet in the Bible.
I hadn't either, and I saw that last night, and something I was reading, and it caught my eye. I went, oh, I missed that. Where was it?
That was very.
So, okay, so let's do first use of Hebrew name. Give me that. Was that 14? What was the 13? Okay, and I looked it up, and it's number 5680. Did you look it up? Oh, good. Tell me what you learned.
So I saw two completely different meanings of the word. One is descendant of Eber.
Okay, and is that going to apply here?
I think so. We haven't.
In the genealogies, he's a descendant of
It can follow? Okay.
And the other was one from beyond.
Yes, from beyond the land or from another country.
That makes sense.
Doesn't that make sense? It really does. So I guess both are suitable because if he's, I didn't see the Eber one. I missed that one on mine. I put on here a designation given to Abram. It recognized him as a specific ethnic group and the leader of them, meaning one from beyond. So, but it's the first time, in other words, he's given a distinction of a people group. Now, why might that be interesting? It's the glimmer of the future that there's going to be a Hebrew nation.
Eber was the father of Peleg.
Yes.
Okay, got it. Yeah, okay, that's good. And it's the same one, the same Eber, you think?
Yeah,
Oh,
sure is. So
okay.
that says that Hebrews are all descendants of both Peleg and
Oh, and therefore, they are of which bloodline?
of Shem.
And that makes them the bloodline of the righteous bloodline. So that's really cool. The Hebrew, again, continues through the righteous bloodline. So it's called from, well, let me see, I forgot to write down. One from beyond.
And the references to Eber are Genesis 11, 14 through 17.
And so you're going to say this is of the line
Descendant of Eber.
of Eber. And from Eber it goes to Peleg? Peleg. I'm going to do this, the godly bloodline. And I kind of hate that phrase, bloodline, because it's not as if you inherit through your bloodline thing, but it is the bloodline that we are following, which links to follow the righteousness in walking with God. It that way, but okay. So this is the first time this ethnic group is identified. Okay, that's kind of cool. Okay, very neat. On in 13 to 16.
We got about 15 minutes.
Okay, we got to hurry. Hurry up, answer. What is Abram doing in 13 to 15?
He's just living his life. And then somebody comes along and says, hey, there was a war and Lot's gone.
Lot is gone. And so and then he says, what is he going to do? What does he do in verse 15?
Chases them to Dan and recaptures
Yeah. Okay, so there you go. He rescues Lot. So 13 to 16, Abram, is he fearful or fearless?
Fearless.
Okay.
And he's prepared. He already had everybody trained.
Yeah.
Because it says forces?
And because they're trained men. They were trained men of war.
Oh, I see, trained men.
Yeah. So here we see his faith, right? I mean, and he goes against odds on this. I mean, these men that he's going against here have just taken down the giants of the land. And he rescues Lot, and he does so with just 318 men, plus his allies, which are 3 brothers, with their whoever is with them, however many. And it doesn't tell us how many. Apparently, it's not that significant of amount. It may be a few dozen or something of each family line, it was my guess. But whoever it is, these are the 3 men that go with it. They're Amorites, the 3 brothers, Amri, Eshcol, and Adner, right? And these are all brothers. They're all Canaanites. They're all Amorite. And they were down living down, which I think is really interesting because one of them, Mamre, remember, lives by the oaks of Mamre, right? Which means he's living down on their land. And they like him so much, they go to war with him to help him get Lot back. But not only that, but also to probably take avenge on their own land. This is their property, right? And that area that would all belong to these Amorites. So they went with him. But in doing so, they met this unsurmountable army, basically, and they supernaturally take these down by night. All right, then in 17 to 24, Melchizedek. Now we're into it interesting. So here we see Abram does what? Yeah. He pays tithes to Melchizedek.
And he brought out bread and wine.
Yeah, Melchizedek does several things. Okay, Melchizedek, he blesses Abram. I want to make a list on him. Let's do this. Melchizedek. He blesses Abraham. What verse was that? 19? Okay, 19. And give me some qualifiers. How do you identify Melchizedek?
Priest of God Most High.
Okay. Priest of God Most High. Very interesting. King of Salem. Now, what is that about? Later, it's going to be Jerusalem. Oops.
So this is the first mention of Jerusalem in the Bible.
Yeah.
I thought it was the city of David. I didn't think of it as pre-existing.
Is there like something that tells us that the king is, that Salem becomes Jerusalem?
Yeah. If you do your word studies on Salem, it's Jerusalem. Hey, say it again. Know that? Oh my gosh, that is so cool. I like that. Priest of God Most High. That's a name to live up to. Okay, blessed God Most High, he gave. Now, when Melchizedek goes to bless Abram, what is the interesting twist on that? Is he actually saying that he's blessing Abram? No. What is he saying? That God, he is blessed of God Most High. That Abram is blessed of God Most High. So Melchizedek blesses Abram is really wrong, isn't it?
Yeah.
God
But he blesses
calls
God, which I thought was interesting.
Abram blessed of God Most High. I didn't have room to write it all in there, so I just abbreviated that. That's an acronym for you. That is God Most High, just so you know what I'm doing there. Okay. Now, concerning Abram, what do we see about Abram here? What does he do in response to what's going on? Yeah, well, and when he responds, he says about, he receives from Melchizedek this blessing, right? That he calls him blessed of God Most High. But then Abram turns around and what does he do? What does he do for Melchizedek?
Gives them a bunch of spoils.
He pays a tithe to Melchizedek. And then he also, concerning Sodom, when the king of Sodom says, oh, just take your spoils, what does he say? No. And he refuses.
Well, it sounds to me that he and God had a conversation because he says, I have sworn to the Lord Most High that I'm not going to take anything from you. So.
Now, why would he do that?
Because God was going to make him rich, not anybody else.
Yeah, because as a matter of fact, what had Melchizedek already said about God Most High? Who took this battle? Who won this thing? Was it Abram? No, he literally said, he is the one who has delivered your enemies into your hand, right? So Melchizedek makes it clear that he recognizes that Abram is blessed, that it's God who gave Abram this victory, not Abram. Abram didn't do it, even though he only had 318 men. I mean, that is an impossibility, right? Don't try that today. Unless you know God's on your side, don't do that. So in response, then, Abram, acknowledging this, he returns a tenth of all that he has to Melchizedek. He tithes to him. Now, then he turns around, and there's like this contrast, though, with how he deals with Sodom. When the king of Sodom wants to reward him or give him, acknowledge a blessing for him, he refuses it because why? Yes, because, so translate that into what is he actually trying to do then? Yes, he doesn't want to rob God of his glory. By refusing to take something from this king of Solomon, he's making sure that God gets the glory for what happened in that battle. And so he does not want to receive. He refuses spoils from Sodom, and therefore he directs glory to God. Okay? Wow. So we see his faith in full motion here, don't we? This is a much better closing to it. We see also in this something else about him. Besides his faith, what do we see? What are you seeing in his personality here when he's directing the glory to God? Refusing to receive. Yes, his humility. He's recognizing that it isn't him, that it's God. So we're seeing his humility. So we've just seen his faith turn to a place of humbling. This is significant because this is a progression of relationship with God. Sometimes you start out by just following God and obeying because God's made you promises. And isn't that kind of how a lot of us start when we start our relationship with God? We're looking at it from the perspective of what can I get out of this, right? What does God have to offer me? Interested in living that kind of a life that the Christians live. In our world today is what I'm speaking of, not his world. But in our world, we look at it as, what does Christianity have to offer to me? So if in the beginning what God does is saying, I will give you salvation, for many people, that's the reason you want it. Or I will give you peace. Many people are just so desperate for peace in their heart, in their lives. Their life is so full of turmoil and pain. They just want relief, right? So they go to God for that. Whatever the promises are that individual is, that's where they start. They start by saying, what can I get from God, right? But as you begin to walk with God, and little by little, this mustard seed of faith that's begun is being tested, tried and tested, ups and downs. Eventually, now we're getting to a place where he's had this. He's had his failures, he's had his faith, he's had his faith, and now he's becoming humble before God. And this is the progress that you want to see in a person who's coming toward God into faith. Because then, once you get a person on their knees, recognizing that everything that is going on in their life is due to God's grace, God's goodness, God's leading, God's sovereignty, God's protection, that God is the focus of it all, and to him is all the glory due. Once you can get them there, now what are they going to be ready for? Covenant. That covenant. Entering into covenant, a true covenant with God. This is a great... Now, do we have any time to go over the special... let's see. We see in this, that who gets the glory? God, so it has to be about God. What does God do? Yeah, God delivers or God rescues. And delivers. He rescues Lot, and he delivers.
This is just the first time he rescues and delivers Lot. He's got another one coming.
Yeah, I know. Exactly. Okay, I just said that I took it out of verse 20 that he delivers enemies into Abram's hand. And the reason I chose that is because this is what I see in the life of a believer, is that God has given us assurance. There's a verse here I want to read in closing. It's in Romans 8. It says, what then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who is against us? He who did not spare his own son, but delivered him up for us all, how will he not also with him freely give us all things? Who will bring a charge against God's elect? God is the one who justifies. Who is the one? Christ Jesus, who died, yes, rather who was raised, who is at the right hand of God, who also intercedes for us. Who will separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? For as it is written, for thy sake we are being put to death all day long. We were considered as sheep to be slaughtered. Here's the grand finale. But in all these things we are overwhelmingly conquerors through him who loved us. I am convinced that neither death nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor any other created thing shall be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus. That was Romans 8. I read from 31 to 39. And in that, I think it really kind of encapsulates everything that we've just seen demonstrated in the life of Abram. We've seen a lot of firsts. We saw the first patriarchal era of through the word Hebrew. We saw the first tithe. First what? Yes, first
Because up till
priest.
now, there's been altars and sacrifices that were correct to God going. Cain and Abel's were wrong.
I
Those altars and all that, but this is interesting. The first time the priest shows up, he comes with bread and wine.
yes,
Not with a blood altar, like a sacrifice.
just like communion. Just like communion. And you know, I wish I had more time. Now see, Melchizedek is such a great thing to go in. And if you don't understand Melchizedek, you need to dig it out more thoroughly. But Melchizedek is a prototype of Christ. And since he is the first introduction to what is a priest, it's not a priest of the Levitical priesthood that we're introduced to. We are introduced to Melchizedek, who is a priest perpetually, forever, who is without beginning and without end. Now, is he literally without beginning and without end? No, not that man wasn't. But because there's a record in that day of his birth and his death, he didn't belong to a Levitical priest line, therefore there was no record of it. And so in its reality, there was no beginning or end because they had no record of it, right? So in that, there's a personification that is just like Jesus Christ will be. The true priest, when he comes, no beginning, no end. He's a perpetual priest forever. And so this Melchizedek becomes that foreshadowing of what Jesus will be in the book of Hebrews, which is where we went and we did all of our extra work on that. And so hopefully that helps give you a little guidance to go back and relook at that. But it's the first use of priest, which means it's a foreshadow,
Christ, the great high priest.
yeah, of Jesus, our great high priest. I love that. And it also shows what was in the land, knowledge of God Most High, also knowledge of worship, because they had a priesthood. They understood tithing. Tithing was already going on. We aren't told about it, but here it is, right? Well, there were some others. Were there any other first that we want to, that are real significant?
I think somebody mentioned Jerusalem.
First mention of Salem, yeah. Okay, and it will be Jerusalem. And and what are the qualifiers about Salem? Out of it, worship of God Most High. I love that. I didn't even think of that one till just now. But the first mention of Salem shows Salem as being a place out of which worship for God Most High occurs. First use of it. That's good. All right, thank you guys. I'm sorry we didn't have time. We always are too short, but thank you. We'll see you next week. Or 2 weeks from now. 2 weeks from now.